Here is a brown ink by Tag Kyo no Oto's Ochiguri Iro. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook. It's a very nice brown from every pen I used it in. Often I got this kind of milk chocolate look, and I was really enjoying it, though I normally don't care for the chocolate tone of brown. This one, it reminded me of it without really being that. There's some color variation by pen, but only from the extremes, like the soft fine that's very dry or a broad nib. But other than that, it's a very predictable and boring color, boring being beautiful again. And with this ink, that's really a good thing because you really want to know the color that you're going to get. The midtones that come from this are absolutely beautiful, and I want those as much as possible. It does shade very nicely and pretty consistently. Always looking good, really. Again, seeing this makes me wonder why more people don't have brown as a preferred color they use. This ink really leaves me wondering on that, kind of stuck. The pen for today is a Diplomat Arrow. All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib which writes rather dry, a Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet, a Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow, a Lamy Safari with a broad nib that writes average. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there, starting with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the soft fine nib, we get a nice lighter brown, but still very easy to read on the page. Very much a brown. No other kind of tones coming through as the undertones. Doing a great job with no feathering, no spread. It shades very well and very consistently. The dark letters don't just show up all of a sudden, but it really transitions into and out of those darker letters. Very, very, very impressive. Honest, I'm impressed with this ink, enjoying it so much. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine. A bit darker, not tons darker, but a bit darker. Now, we get no feather and we get no spread. We get plenty of great shading, still doing a very nice, gentle in and out of dark letters. And with that, we're getting a ton of the midtones that I'm enjoying a lot, really giving those darker letters the opportunity to draw attention to what's being written on the page in the most favorable way. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine, with no feather, with no spread, still with very nice shading, really showing off all of those midtones that I'm enjoying so much. The darker brown that's occurring is still brown. It's not getting to the point of almost black. And though I do enjoy when a brown does that, when a brown is shading this well, you can't help but truly enjoy it. Looking at the broad nib, it is darker than it was with the medium nib. There is no feathering. There is no spread. There is shading. And while it is in general darker, you do occasionally get some of the lighter tones. Only occasionally, really. But also, just as occasionally, the much darker tones. Take a look at the word called on the first line. The C is a nice midtone. The A gets very dark. The L's go to a nice midtone. The D, very dark. Nice to see all of that working very nicely with its gentle in and out of shading. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle.
This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There's approximately 6 milliliters of ink left.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We still get a very nice shading all the way through. I do get the tiniest hint of a red undertone going on this paper. It seems to be showing it just as the lighter letters, but it's never coming across as a red in any point. It's always being a brown, so I'm not minding that red undertone coming through. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, bit darker than we had on the Clairfontaine, almost as dark as it was with the broad, honestly, on the Clairfontaine. Now, there's no feathering and there is no spread. There is shading. The shading's doing a very nice job in what's happening. Really, we're getting a lot of the mid and darker tones, not very much of the lighter tones coming through here, but you really see the shading very nice on the second line, the word cheery, on the third line, the word properly, really showing off the shading very well. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as it was with the soft fine, which is a little bit darker than we had on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We still get very nice shading. Look at tunnels on the first line. Nice light letters to start with. The ends get just a little bit darker in those midtones. The L and S, much darker than the rest of the word. Same with of. Of starts dark, gets a little bit lighter, and then darkens right up again. Really nice in and out of all of that shading. And that's just on the first line. Looking at the broad nib, it is a little bit darker than it was with the medium nib, just a tad bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. No feathering, no spread. While in general, I want to say that it's darker than we had on the Clairfontaine, I think the shading is showing up a little bit nicer because here, while it is darker, we're certainly getting a lot more shift in and out of those midtones with the dark, really making the shade stand out especially well. Looking at the back of the page, we have no ghosting and nothing bled through touching the page underneath.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is a little bit darker in tone than we had on the Clairfontaine, a little bit more red leaning as a result of the tone of the paper. We're definitely seeing that red undertone coming through quite a bit more here. Now, we're not getting any kind of feathering or spread. The shading is doing much better here than it did on the Clairfontaine. Really, it's shading so frequently in and out of dark letters, it's head and shoulders above what I saw in the Clairfontaine for shading, and it looked really good there. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, darker than it was on the Clairfontaine, still being a bit more red leaning as a result of the paper. Now, we get no feathering and we get no spread. We do get shading. It is shading more frequently than it did on the Clairfontaine. but I don't think it's looking better for it. I think the shading that was going on in the Clairefontaine looked much better, but that could be a result of how it's looking much more red leaning, which isn't my favorite color of ink. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine. A little bit darker than the Clairefontaine, still certainly much more red leaning than it was on the Clairefontaine, where we really didn't have that. Now, no feathering and no spread. Shading, it does occur not as often as it did on the Clairefontaine, not as often as it did on the wet fine. We can spot some darker letters, but for the most part, it looks like a single tone with an occasional dark spot. Looking at the broad nib, it is a little bit darker than it was with the medium, about as dark as we had on the Clairefontaine. Certainly very red leaning here as a comparison. Now it does feather just a little bit. You see it on that on the first line. You see it on pretty on the second line. You see it on same and twist, third and fourth line. So certainly some feathering going on. The tiniest bit of spread is occurring here. Now the feathering and the spread I don't see as a major issue, but they are present. Now as far as shading, it's not shading nearly as well as it did on the Clairefontaine, though when it does it, I think it's doing a very nice job. Unfortunately, the shading comes with additional feathering and spread like it's doing on that and was on the first line. Looking at the back of the page, the ghosting's not too bad. It certainly gets much deeper when you see on the broad, though I do think you could write on the back of this page without any kind of problem. Nothing bled through touching the page underneath.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is the same tone that we got on the Clairefontaine. We still get no feathering. We still get no spread. That reddish undertone that was on the last paper, gone. Back to being purely a brown ink. Very nice. Now it's shading, and it is shading, I think, a little bit better than it did on the Clairefontaine. It certainly is shading just as frequently. I just think it's looking a little bit nicer. And it's a dark enough ink that the vertical lines, almost forgot which was which on vertical and horizontal. The vertical lines aren't really detracting from the ink with it being dark enough to not be any kind of a problem. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairefontaine. The same tone, or sorry, darker than it was with the soft fine, the same tone as the Clairefontaine. My goodness. Am I just flubbing my own lines? I'm going to leave this bit in. There's no feathering. There's no spread. There is some shading, though much more here is the darker tone than it was on the Clairefontaine, but it's still shading very well. You see it happening nicely with on the first line, but more, again, we get occasional, we get the light letters into dark, or a light letter into, or a dark word into a light letter. Not as nice. It's doing a good job, but not as nice to look at here as it was with the soft fine on this paper or on the Clairefontaine. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine, the same tone as the Clairefontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade just as well as the Clairefontaine, which is much better than it was doing with the wet fine here on this paper. I don't think you're losing out at all. And again, it's dark enough that I'm able to look past those vertical lines and not have any kind of a problem. I've really come to appreciate what they do to help whether an ink is stand out on the page or not, where before the vertical lines were a bit distracting. I feel like now it's giving me this point that it lets me know how standout a color is for the page. Looking at the broad nib, it is a bit darker than it was with the medium nib, a little lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we do get shading, bit better shading than we had on the Clairfontaine, really giving us some dark letters throughout and fairly consistent, again, with a nice gentle in and out of it. Take a look at except on the first line, the crossing of the X, nice, but the EP starts getting darker. It lightens up into the T where it gets dark again. And the right next to it starts light, gets dark, and gets very dark at the E, but the top of the H is very light. Very nice. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Diamine Chocolate Brown. Here is Monteverde Scotch Brown. Here is Private Reserve Fast Dry Chocolate. Here is Kayo Iro Stone Road of Guion. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, yet it even appears a little bit easier to read because of the slight off-white tone of this paper. It's dark enough that the vertical lines aren't being any kind of a problem. There's no feather. There is no spread. There is shading going on, which this paper does not always really highlight well for inks, but there is enough shading happening that you can see it. Now, it's not giving the very dark tone very often. Much more you're getting the mids and lighters, like on the word long on the second line. Nice mid-tone, lightens up, and then gets back into that mid-tone on the G. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, tad bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine, certainly standing out on the page very nicely in its color, really holding on to that brown. I was expecting to see more of the reddish undertones come through here. They didn't. No feather, no spread, very nice shading. Take a look at the third line, the word without, and without a doubt, this ink is shading very nicely as it goes mid to dark to mid to dark. Nice. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine nib. Tad, yeah, you know, I almost want to say a tad bit lighter than the wet fine, but no, it's right about the same tone. Now, we get no feathering, we get no spread, we do get shading. The shading's going very nicely. I think the shading looked a little bit nicer on the wet fine than it is here with this medium. That is a medium flow pen, but we're definitely getting it. We're just getting much less extremes in it. Now, pull on the first line starts as a darker midtone, lightens up on the U, darkens on the first L, lightens up into the D, but gets very dark at the end of the D. Nice, a sharp, still first line, lighter to darker, light at the R, dark at the P. I really do appreciate seeing this much tone variation in a single word. Looking at the broad nib, it is a little bit darker than we had with the medium nib, quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Now, there is no feathering and there is no spread and there is some shading. Yes, technically, like you see it in the and passage or deep on the second line. But for the most part, what I see is like the third line, fairly uniform. The sword was hardly. Same tone, and you get that a lot here. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see color comparables, I prefer to see an ink that complements the color on the page. Here is a pink ink by Private Reserve Shell Pink. Here is a green ink by Califolio Olive. Here is an orange ink by Krishna Palasa. Here is a blue-black ink by Califolio Cassis. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We do get feathering, a lot of feathering, but it's not the end of the world and not something that would stop most people using this paper from using this ink. We do get some spread, almost up to a medium. We do get a couple moments of shading, which I'm going to say they're there, but I'm hoping that they're there and it's good and that it didn't bleed through. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, quite a bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. Yes, we get feathering consistently the whole way through. Yes, we get spread almost up like a medium broad here. We don't really get shading. It's a fairly uniform tone, but here in this tone, we do see some of the reddish undertones of the ink coming through from this paper. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as it was with the soft fine, darker than it was on the Clairfontaine, with feathering, with spread, with no shading. It's just there, and you really do see here that reddish lean that the paper is causing this to have. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as it was with the medium. About as dark-ish as it was on the Clairfontaine. Now, we do get feathering and we do get spread, and in this case, I do think it's a little much, but it's not any more spread than it was with the other pens. It's just that it's much more noticeable going broad as getting broader. Makes you almost feel like you're writing with a marker some. No shading, no problem there. Definitely still a red-leaning color that we're getting. Not my favorite in tone that I'm seeing as a result of the paper. Looking at the page underneath, you see there's a few spots that have been circled that it did bleed through touching the page underneath, and seeing the back of the page, there's no question why with the extreme ghosting. Remember that from the 80s? Extreme. That's this for ghosting. This paper, not this ink.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
While this ink certainly could be a dealer's choice, I didn't care for it as much in the drier fine pens. That little bit of lightening up that it had just wasn't my favorite of the tones. Same with the broad pens. I found that it just didn't give me the tone that I was enjoying the most. Not that either of those were bad, so by all means, it would still be a great choice. But a medium to wet flow, fine or medium nib, really gave the color that I was enjoying the most here, and it shaded very well.
This is the end, and thanks for watching.